promised a review, you're going to get it tonight.
The Dan Yorke State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Taco Comfort Solutions.
Welcome aboard. You know, as we produce the program, and we do each and every early afternoon, the news on this train wreck is tough. Thankfully, there's nobody in Congress that was seriously hurt, but unfortunately, at least one young person lost his life on that garbage truck. Will be more details, of course, in the news over the course of the evening. But quite the jolt for Republicans who are heading for a retreat in West Virginia. Was there a jolt for America last night when it came to the president's speech? Well, it seemed like a lot of people thought it was at least competent, if not pleasing to their ears. So we'll talk about what the numbers really mean and how the messages were received by not only the nation, but our region here with pollster Joe Fleming tonight and a special guest from Providence College at the Political Science Department. Great to have you in. Headlines like this all day today. Appeal for unity, exactly what I predicted, and I don't know, hundreds of millions of others predicted. What's he going to do? Appeal for strife? We should fight each other to the death. It's what he tweets and does as opposed to what he says in a State of the Union, right? But here's CBS's wrap up.
That the state of our union is strong because our people are strong.
President Trump touted his accomplishments during his first State of the Union address.
Since the election, we have created 2.4 million new jobs.
And he laid out what he believes his duty is as President of the United States.
To defend Americans, to protect their safety, their families, their communities, and their right to the American dream. Because Americans are dreamers too.
That line in particular rankled Democrats who are fighting to protect undocumented immigrants brought to this country as children and are sometimes called dreamers.
The president presents himself as generous toward dreamers, but he's holding them hostage to the most extreme anti-immigrant agenda in generations.
The White House says Mr. Trump's speech was supposed to be a unifying message that cuts through partisanship, but Democrats found little in the message to cheer about. Many sat in stony silence throughout most of the address, and they particularly bristled when the president equated immigration with gangs and drug violence.
And I think that was very disappointing when you always equate immigration with the worst of people.
But not every Democrat remained seated. West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin frequently rose for applause.
Just to sit there and frown is not going to fix anything. So let's embrace each other and try to make it work. And when we disagree, we can work through that.
A CBS News poll shows 3 out of 4 Americans who saw the speech approve of the president's message.
Which is going to just make him so happy. And why wouldn't it? I mean, why wouldn't it? But we know he's so poll-driven, Joe, that that's got to be like, he might not know what to do with himself this morning.
One thing, when they released that poll this morning, one of the comments I heard was 45% of the sample were Republicans, 25% Democrats. So it may have been skewed a little bit Republican.
Okay.
So you got to keep that in mind. But still, it's a good number for the president, no question at all.
For any president.
For any president. But again, he came out talking unity. He talked the talk, but now really walked the walk.
Well, we got to talk about the dynamics of how people respond to this stuff. Adam Meyers is a professor of political science at Providence College. Great to have you aboard. Thanks.
Happy to be here.
First time on Dan Yorke's State of Mind. What was your overall take from last night's presentation?
My overall take was that I thought he did a good job. Now, having said that, it's important to bear in mind that I can't remember the last State of the Union address in which the widespread consensus was it was a complete and utter flop. Presidents usually do a good job, but he met expectations, and so from that perspective, it was a win for him. And clearly, I mean, the bias in the poll notwithstanding, it seems like the American people appreciated the speech. I'd push back a little bit against a lot of what the commentariat is saying today. A lot of people are saying, it was a unifying speech. The president tried to unify the country around, our national identity, et cetera. There was some of that. I don't deny that. But there was also a lot of partisan fodder in there.
And to be honest with it, I mean, I don't know if there was a smile meter, But he was scowling a lot.
Oh yeah,
he was doing a lot of scowling, and
Democrats were scowling back.
And there were a lot of hidden messages, and I think he got the vibe. You know, he's very vibe oriented, and so if half the room is just not buying in, I think it starts to wear on him a little bit. But style, we always talk about style, and the following week it just goes away. It's all about policy and decisions.
But reading from a teleprompter is not Donald Trump's forte. He'd rather talk off the cuff. That's when you're going to see him smiling.
Yeah, but
more.
it's his security. It's everyone around him security blanket.
The people around them, absolutely. Donald Trump,
because they don't trust him.
Right.
They just don't. They don't trust him. So, but
and he did a good job staying on the teleprompter.
And again, let's not pick on him. Every president uses a teleprompter.
Yes. No, I agree, but he's not comfortable using what I'm saying.
Yeah. All right. Rather than me asking a few questions that I have first, what was striking to you about what policy message came out of the speech last night?
Well, there weren't a whole lot of policy specifics. There were a lot of generalities. The four pillars of his immigration plan, the legalization of the Dreamers, accompanied by ending chain migration, transforming to a merit-based immigration system, and ending the diversity visa lottery. That was about as specific as he got.
I'm not sure the Senate wants all four of those. I think the House does. And so it's going to be interesting to see how Republicans differ between the House and the Senate.
Absolutely, and I think even in the House, there's some differences of opinion with the president among the Republicans. I think there's a sense that the amount of time it's going to take to begin the process of ending the quote unquote chain migration is a little too long. There's a few other details in there that I heard some House Republicans complaining about this morning. And of course, I think the Democrats find a lot not to like in his plan.
Well, it's interesting, Joe, you're going to say?
No, I was just going to say, obviously, I think what the president was doing, and I think it was a smart thing on his part, was throwing this all out, now asking the Congress to negotiate and work it out with each other. The biggest problem in the Congress is simply you have the extreme left and the extreme right who don't want to compromise at all. And that's what's hurting a lot of times. And unless they can get these two ends to start to compromise, and I think that's what the president's trying to do, is throw it out there, see if the Congress can now try to come up with something in the middle ground maybe that he can sign and go with. But again, it's going to take a lot of work to move the extremes.
But what he doesn't have a grasp on at all is leading from a 36,000-foot perspective to say, hey, by the way, we ought to decide these things not under the gun of yet another continuing resolution to keep the government open. I mean, that expires in a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And whatever promises made by the Senate leadership to go ahead and work on DACA/wall limited, put things on the floor, get a legislative discussion of some kind of normalcy, whatever veiled promise came 10 days ago, I'm not so sure that's going to stick. And so we're going to be right back in the same soup we were 3 weeks ago. And he didn't address how we should be comporting ourselves. He doesn't seem to have that grasp, nor does it really concern him, because he's transactional by his nature, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, first of all, the notion that Congress is going to pass his four-pillar immigration reform plan by February 8th, that's complete and utter nonsense. That's a fantasy. It's not going to happen. So they're going to have to come up with some sort of more minor fix between now and then. And my guess is, they will. Although, at some point in time, the Democrats, if they really are as serious as they say they are about finding a solution for the Dreamers, they're going to have to, really stick by their guns and force the president and the Republicans to do something.
Yeah, but using government funding, I think, is a weapon that will boomerang on them.
Impasse politics never works. We've discovered that over and over again. We discovered that when the Republicans tried to shut down the government in '95. We discovered it when the Republicans, in Congress, shut down the government under President Obama in 2013, and now we're discovering when the Democrats are doing it to President Trump. I don't know why people continuously think that this is a good strategy. It just never works.
All right, I would think that even getting past the March 5th deadline on the DACA deadline, I would think that as those stories become more human of some deportations, and as we get closer to the elections, all of a sudden it becomes a very real, arguable matter within the public on an organic basis. And I think if it's already 80–90% America empathy for the DACA, I think that would only grow, right? So I'm not so sure they ought to be using deadlines. When we come back, we'll talk about the Democratic response and some of the hidden messages that the president, I don't think really hid, but I think he thinks he was hiding them. We'll be right back. Oh, in the meantime, let me just tell you, sorry about that. You need to get your money together? Card Valet, right there in your hand. Right there. It's an app. You just get it, open it, download it. And you can do everything in your banking life, not just the typical online stuff, but everything in your banking life right on your smartphone in the palm of your hand with the folks at Navigant Credit Union, online at navigantcu.org. Be right back.
I think the president proved he can read words written for him on a teleprompter. Talked about things like taking care of our veterans, but then doesn't properly fund the VA Choice program. He talked about the importance of the opioid crisis and responding, but doesn't provide funding for the opioid crisis. So I think we've all learned, let's focus on what the president actually does, not what he says.
You know, what's interesting about that response by Congressman Cicilline is that I think Democrats, and everybody, myself included, who have been chronically critical of the president, I think we've got to be careful not to be so condescending that we're applauding him for able to make it through a teleprompter presentation. I think that for that middle ground of people who are really trying to just find out where we are on the issues, I think that's offensive. Do you agree?
I completely agree. Democrats are in danger of overstepping themselves.
Their disdain for him is palpable.
Exactly. And as you say, ordinary Americans want the President of the United States to be respected. And when kind of the hatred, the personal animosity that people feel for the President overwhelms their ability to show respect for the office, I think a lot of people respond to that in negative ways.
Yet the polling data shows that most people don't respect him as a person, and he's done a good job of creating that himself.
Yes, I was going to say that, Dan. He's created a lot of that himself. If he can change that image by cutting the tweeting down, and doing more presidential things, acting more presidential, I really think his numbers will start to go up because the economy is going well, unemployment's way down. There's a lot of real positive things that a president should have real high numbers as a result. I think if he changes the way he handles the office, his numbers will go up, and the Democrats could be in a very tough position.
You can improve your brand, right? You know that. You've seen numbers move on people your entire career.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and given the fundamentals of the country right now, as Joe said, given how well the economy is doing, et cetera, his approval rating should be a lot higher than it is. So Joe's absolutely right. Now, is he going to be able to contain himself? I kind of doubt it. I imagine that within 2 days we're going to get all sorts of crazy tweets again. We're not going to be talking about his, solid State of the Union performance anymore, and it might not even be 24 hours.
And his tweets are going to be centered on this other sidebar controversy that we have going on whether we're going to release a GOP House Intelligence memo, where the Justice Department is literally standing on its head screaming no, 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 and the chairman of House Intelligence and the president's core are hell-bent on getting it out in the 5-day window that we're on day 3 now of. So today, tomorrow, that's going to wreak havoc, and he's going to be in a brawl on that. And I wonder why he doesn't recognize. I know he thinks this is the way to win the court of public opinion on the Russian investigation. Right. But it will distract from everything that he may have built in the State of the Union.
Right, and let's be honest, he's not going to win the court of public opinion on the Russian investigation via the release of this memo because everybody's just going to retreat to their partisan sides. Republicans are going to buy what the memo says, Democrats are not. It's just going, it's the reaction to it's going to be very polarized. What he really should be trying to do right now is kind of ride off of his solid State of the Union performance last night, which would involve probably keeping kind of other headlines from dominating the conversation for at least a few days, but I doubt that's going to happen.
Do you think they can call that audible, given that there's a 75%, hey, pretty good speech, Mr. President? You think there's anybody, Steve Miller or anybody in there that would just go, let's not fight this memo thing right now?
He might get advice to do that, but in the end, he's going to do what he wants to do. I mean, he may think, maybe I won't release the memo now. Maybe we'll keep going with the wave that's going on now. And if I can keep this good spirits going, I can get some things through Congress. I mean, there are things he talked about last night that the Democrats will support, and one of the key ones is infrastructure. They wanted to do that under Obama, which the Republicans stopped. So now he could get Democratic support there. and he could get some infrastructure through by this summer.
Well, we talked about, we've got Senator Reid. We have a statement from Senator Reid on that very thing, buoying Joe's point here, talking about the infrastructure needs, suggesting that there was some kind of ignorance of that. It is amazing in the last sets of administrations how Democrats and Republicans, Congress and the White House, have literally flip-flopped on their support of core issues. The ideological, principled stance of these parties is very hard. You teach about parties at PC.
Right.
It's hard to let these students know exactly what a party stands for anymore these days, because Donald Trump's not the only transactional guy here, it seems to me.
He's not. I guess I would push back on that a little bit. It seems to me that the bulk of the Republicans in Congress are fairly ideologically cohesive about issues like taxes, about issues like, to a lesser extent, immigration, about issues like the Affordable Care Act. I mean, they weren't able to get their act together and repeal the Affordable Care Act because they disagree on some of the nitty-gritty details. I think Donald Trump is...
Well, way before Obama had his success, there were a lot of Republicans who were talking about the same kinds of health insurance changes.
Right.
Look, they're not stripped of their ideology completely, so I'll accept your pushback on that. But it does, things like infrastructure and how it's positioned, and that kind of. You watch the scoreboard; they argue against each other depending on who's sitting in the White House and who has the majority. It feels that way anyway.
Well, I will agree with you on this. Donald Trump has definitely changed, or he's in the process of changing what the Republican Party is about, right? Because in a lot of fundamental ways, he doesn't talk like a traditional Republican, right? He doesn't talk like a traditional Republican on entitlement issues, for example, Social Security, Medicare, et cetera. He emphasizes, for lack of a better way to put it, culture war politics more than like a lot of the establishment Republicans in Congress would want. So to some extent, the Republican Party finds itself in something of an identity crisis right now because the party's been taken over by, a figure who doesn't agree with what its core principles were for 30 years.
But you say the culture war politics, that's probably one of the main reasons his numbers are so low right now.
Yeah.
Because he's going that route, and it's not working for him. I mean, he has the opportunity now, after the speech last night, to change what's happening, to try to work with Democrats, to try to bring everybody together. I think people thought when he first got elected maybe he would do that, but he didn't go that route.
He said something last night, and I apologize we don't have the audio here, but he said something last night about terminating federal employees who aren't serving well. I mean, if that wasn't a telegraph, Bob Mueller, I'm going to pop you, and my acting attorney general, my deputy attorney general, I'm going to pop you. Listen, I'm already halfway purging the FBI, and I'm going to pop you two guys. I mean, why would they? Why?
His base loves it.
Yeah.
He's appealing to his base. He has to throw things out there for the base. Some of the base is not happy with the stuff on immigration he put out there, so he wants to throw things that's going to keep the base happy.
To his credit on the immigration thing, by the way, with DACA, I mean, he's trebled the number.
Yes.
So all those who haven't even bothered to apply for that status are now looped in.
Yep.
So he's holding a carrot out for Democrats that they ought to be salivating over rather than just suggesting that he's not participating.
He is, although what Democrats would like to do is legalize the status of all of the illegal immigrants in this country, not just the ones who are brought here as children. So from their perspective...
Which is something America does not want.
Right. I mean, and obviously that's not going to happen anytime soon.
And the polling data is that America, right, Joe, wants to limit the number of immigrants.
Correct.
How we determine who they are is still up for grabs, but they do want to suppress that number.
Yes.
Yes?
They do. I agree with you there. I think the thing is what the president needs to do is get the Democrats together and work on a compromise for this.
Well,
and that's what's not happening.
I'm not so sure the Democrats are faultless in this compromise thing. We'll talk about Joe Kennedy's speech when we come back. Stay with us.
Bullies may land a punch. They may leave a mark. But they have never, not once, in the history of our United States, managed to match the strength and spirit of a people united in defense of their future. Politicians can be cheered for the promises they make. Our country will be judged by the promises we keep.
I'll tell you, most of the media loved that speech. I thought he was going to potty himself when he first started. He looked so nervous, and I understand that, but he's a Kennedy. He gets a pass. I thought that was an interesting presentation, but let me tell you something. There was no discussion of partnering with this president. You know, the bully inference, it was throw the gauntlet down. We're ready to fight you at every turn. Or did I miss something?
Yeah, so first of all, I have to confess I didn't actually see his speech. I turned off the TV before I had a chance to do it.
How dare you? I can't believe that.
But I did read some of the commentary about it. And I agree with you. Based on what I read, it sounds like it was a very aggressive speech. But that's what the Democratic base wants. And he was playing to the Democratic base.
So these bases are, Joe, is it chicken or the egg? Is the base dictating behavior, or is the behavior building or diminishing base?
I think the base is dictating the behavior at this point. I think that the Democrats are so concerned with their base, they don't want to lose it. The Republicans are so concerned with their base, they don't want to lose it. You know, and they're basically playing into their bases. And that's the problem that we're having right now. Until that changes, we're going to stay right where we are.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think a big part of the reason for that has to do with the role of party primaries. I mean, for several decades now, Republican insurgents have been challenging moderate Republicans in Republican primaries, and that's been pushing the Republican Party to the right. Now Democrats are getting in on that game too, right? Increasingly, Democratic primaries are getting very crowded. Because incumbent members of Congress are drawing challengers who don't think they're sufficiently progressive or sufficient.
Well, we're seeing that right here in our own state house.
Yeah,
Aaron Regenberg yesterday, one of the leaders on the show, you know, one of the leaders of that movement, you know, throwing around single-payer tax and income tax for single-payer health insurance, da-da-da. I mean, and it's got guys like the Speaker of the House spooked. Yeah. Where it used to be his right flank gave him a little headache. They're more aligned with him now than his own Democratic couple of dozen, right?
We're also seeing on the Republican side too. Yeah. It's not, I mean, think about the governor's election 4 years ago. Alan Fung and Ken Block. Alan Fung was being pushed to the right because of Ken Block, and that hurt him in the general election. So we're seeing it on both sides in the state. There's no question.
It's interesting, this whole base politics, because we see more and more Republicans in Congress saying they don't want to do it anymore, right? Because they just can't battle with this base because they're not aligned with them. Will we see the same thing with Democrats?
Absolutely, and look, I mean, there's a number of reasons for why this is happening. One is a lot of congressional districts are not competitive. I mean, this might change in the upcoming midterm elections. But over the past 10 years, in the elections we've had, the number of competitive congressional districts has been, very small, between 25 and 40 from election to election. So what that means is, if a congressional district isn't competitive in a general election, that shifts the focus to the primary, right? Because whoever wins the primary wins the general.
Is the Mueller investigation and the timing of it going to impact this election in 18?
I don't know if I can make a prediction on that one.
The sooner it happens, the less I think the impact, unless the president goes down.
Right.
The later it happens, the more it impacts the election, right? Because it's still a kind of a piece of bait hanging out there for Democrats.
And let's be honest, the president's not going to go down, not as long as Republicans control the House.
Well, isn't that the issue for 18?
Right. If Democrats take control of the House, everything changes.
All bets are up.
Yeah.
All right. Final thought.
Oh, just basically, I think, again, last night the president did a decent job. The question is, can he carry that through for the next couple of weeks, or does it go back to his old ways?
All right, we'll stay tuned. Tomorrow will tell, usually, fellas. Thank you very much. Final word next. So the ACLU is in a little bit of tussle with the town of East Greenwich on what employees can say or do on their social media. It's kind of a fascinating conversation, and we'll have that with the executive director, Steve Brown, tomorrow. We'll see you on the radio at 3 until 6 on WPRO tomorrow afternoon. Thanks for checking in. Good night.